So, welcome to another Ijames webinar. Tonight we're going to be focusing on nutritional approaches to managing cholesterol and CVD. As always, plenty of time for questions at the end, so please stick around. Hopefully this will be a relatively short presentation, so there will be lots of time for you to fire things at me at the end. So let's crack on. So what is cardiovascular disease? Well, in general terms, it can describe any heart or the blood vessels, and it can include anything that goes wrong within the vascular system. So whether that be blood flow to the heart, brain, or any part of the body that's compromised as a result of a blood clot or atherosclerosis, which is when fatty deposits clog up the arteries, and the arteries get hard and narrow, and then we see problems. There are a number of different types of cardiovascular disease, namely coronary heart disease, stroke, peripheral artery disease, and a number of other diseases that all come under the CVD bracket. So this is just a diagram showing, as a basic, what can happen when things start to go wrong and we start to develop cardiovascular disease. You can see right at the top there, we've got a very healthy vascular wall. The endothelium's nice and settled and ordered as it should be. But then as we move down through the chart, we start to see fatty deposits building up. We start to see the increasing collection of inflammatory cells. We then get a layer of endothelial cells that bridge over those fatty and inflammatory cell deposits, and this can either become thick or it can be very thin, and then we get either a stabilized or vulnerable plaque. If the plaque itself ruptures, we get thrombosis and we get a blood clot and problems associated with all of that fatty deposit and inflammatory cells leaking out into the vessels. Alternatively, a stabilized plaque, considered safer than a vulnerable plaque, but the arteries do narrow further and further and the vessels narrow, so the space at which your blood can actually pass through becomes less and less and less, and therefore we get high blood pressure and things all start to get a bit wrong. Ultimately, any one of these can result in a heart attack, stroke, and obviously the major complications associated with cardiovascular disease. Going too far there. So the major risk factors, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of when it comes to cardiovascular disease, are smoking, lack of exercise and movement in general, whether or not we're overweight or obese, metabolic syndrome and specifically diabetes, whether there's a family history. Ethnic background also plays an important role in your risk of developing a cardiovascular complication. Men are more likely to have cardiovascular problems. And also, as we get older, we are at increased risk. There's also the very well-known risk factors of high blood pressure and high blood cholesterol, which are the things that our doctors are now looking for continuously throughout life, and the things that people tend to rely, and in my opinion, all too heavily on as an indicator of whether or not we're high risk. Stress and alcohol consumption, of course, can go hand in hand with the type of job you have and the type of lifestyle you lead, so this can also impact your cardiovascular risk. Traditionally, if you go to your doctor and they notice that you've got high cholesterol, high blood pressure, then they're going to prescribe you more often than not one of these medications, particularly if they've already told you to go away, do a bit of exercise, eat a bit better, and it hasn't worked. Then if you're lucky, you'll get put on any one of these drugs, which I'm sure you've all got a number of clients that come to you and say, I've been taking XYZ, it's not working. What do I do now? So the wonderful thing is that we're now so scared in the UK and the US of cardiovascular disease and these risk factors that have been identified that people are being put on these medications left, right and centre, and actually today over 6 million UK inhabitants are on statins, which is a huge proportion. Around 20% of the US population, which you can only begin to imagine how many people that equates to, are taking or were taking antihypertensives, medications to lower their blood pressure pre-2009. 2 million US inhabitants are taking blood thinners, which is a pretty scary statistic given how horrible blood thinners can be. And if you look up any one of these drugs in the BNF, which is basically a doctor's handbook of drugs, it lists all sorts of lovely side effects, any one of which take your pick, and I'm sure you'd much rather have elevated blood pressure than any one of these. And this isn't to mention some of the worst side effects such as coma and complete liver failure that were listed. So there's all sorts of lovely things to choose from there. Okay, so we all know there's lots of people out there that are at high risk. We are an obesity nation, so we're told after all. So what can we do about it? Well, again, I'm sure you're all very aware. Regularly, our clients and ourselves, if we've ever been to see their GP about this, will be told you need to exercise, you need to lose weight, you need to reduce your stress, and you need to stop smoking. But the major things that people seem to actually do as a first line defense are reduce their fat intake and their cholesterol intake. And this is probably because this dates back well into the 70s, that a doctor decided, because it's fatty deposits that build up and your cholesterol is one of the major determinants of cardiovascular risk, that it must be fat and cholesterol that's causing these problems in the first place. So by reducing our fat intake and reducing our cholesterol intake, we're aiming for this ideal lipid profile, which is down at the bottom there. And as long as our total cholesterol is below 4 millimoles per litre in our blood, then we should generally be quite happy and healthy and free from cardiovascular risk. So they say. So what's the truth? And I'm sure you're all very au fait with the truth behind the fat message. There's been a lot of media and cam channel support for basically forgetting this whole fat-free and low cholesterol message, and I'm sure it's something you're all promoting to your clients, as I have been for a number of years now. But what happens when we actually try and reduce fat intake in our diet? Well, as soon as you take the fat out of something that's supposed to have fat in it, you take away the flavor, you take away the texture, and you take away the satisfaction. Fat is one of the major constituents of our food that are associated with satiety and the pleasure that we gain from the food. So if we're taking that away, we're no longer actually experiencing the same level of satisfaction from those foods. So we're eating more of them because we're not getting those brain signals that are telling us, I've enjoyed that, I've had enough. Also, when we take out the fat, in order to make something edible and not taste absolutely awful, we end up putting in a load of sugar as well as a load of artificial ingredients like thickeners to make it even vaguely resemble the food it was meant to be when it had the fat in it. So you're ending up with this non-food, which we're all being told is healthy because it's fat-free, and of course we know otherwise. So the physiological implication of removing the fat is body-wide, and it's quite scary when you think about the role of fat. It's an essential membrane component of every single cell in our body, and we need saturated fat for that as well, not just the other fats and the monounsaturates and the polyunsaturates. It's also a really efficient source of fuel. Humans are, in essence, designed to thrive on fat, otherwise we wouldn't be so good at storing it, and it also wouldn't be so energy efficient. We get 9 calories per gram of fat versus only 4 from carbohydrate storage. So it really is quite an effective fuel for human beings to rely on. Add to that the fact that fat storage within the body not only insulates us and protects our organs, but it's vitally important for chemical messengers, lipid messengers. It works hand in hand with proteins to aid function of the body. It's part of the normal growth of our cells. It's vitally important for our immune function as well as reproduction, obviously being one of the major precursors to reproductive hormones. And it's involved in a number of aspects of basic metabolism. So we take out the fat, we basically take out the ability for our body to function, and no wonder we're all starting to see such awful things going wrong. Similar story for cholesterol. If we lower our cholesterol intake, we're lowering that preformed and readily available source of building blocks for our hormones, as well as reducing our ability to produce bile acids, which are essential for digestion. And of course, we can't synthesize things like vitamin D. So we really are looking at giving ourselves a number of problems completely aside from cardiovascular risk and just making everything a whole lot worse. So thankfully, but it only just being sort of covered in the media, it's now widely recognized that the dietary intake of cholesterol is very, very little to do with our total circulating cholesterol levels. And there's a study there that was in the British Heart Journal. It was actually published in the 70s, which found that our dietary cholesterol intake had very little impact on how much cholesterol we had in our blood, and it had no impact pretty much at all on our coronary heart disease risk and mortality. And the reason for this is that our body has the ability to synthesize cholesterol. So if you haven't got much coming in the diet, your body's mechanisms will compensate for that. If you've got too much coming in from the diet, likewise your body will downregulate its natural synthesis. And so we maintain this equilibrium whereby our cholesterol is happy and healthy. And largely, no matter what we eat, everything's going to be okay. And that's shown again in a study carried out in the 70s. So goodness only knows why we didn't recognize this sooner, and it's been all over public health media. But this study was actually carried out in pregnant women. So these women had fetus in the womb, they were wanting the optimal dietary profiles, and they were grouped up, given various different cholesterol levels in their diets, and it didn't matter what level of dietary cholesterol they received. Their infants were healthy, their plasma levels of cholesterol were healthy, and it really didn't seem to impact. There's a few more studies just there showing the real importance of cholesterol and the horrible things we can inflict upon ourselves if we focus on reducing cholesterol in the diet. Cholesterol is essential for the activity of our macrophages in being able to engulf bacteria and therefore support and have an effective immune system. Without effective function of our macrophages, we're going to be riddled with bacteria and viruses because they just can't function and to consume those and break them down. Cholesterol is also very, very essential in maintaining our central nervous system. Our synaptic plasticity is the ability of our neurons to develop and change according to our body's requirements. And if we reduce cholesterol in our diets, if we don't have enough cholesterol production in the body, we lose this ability for our synaptic plasticity to adapt as is required. And this is now being linked to neuronal degeneration and things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease. So many of you may have read one of the articles in CAM magazine recently, but it's really a key that this low fat, low cholesterol message that's been promoted so much is now we're seeing full circle, as we have done with many previous public health messages, that things are starting to come back and bite us in the butt, excuse my French. But things are not as plain as they seem, and we can actually, by manipulating things too far, give ourselves increased risk of a number of complications. Cholesterol is involved in sperm capacitation, so anyone trying to conceive, if their husbands are on statins or they're actively pursuing a low cholesterol diet, then this could be problematic. And finally, at the bottom there, it's just a slightly interesting study that I found. Cytosine arabinoside is actually a chemotherapy. So you can see there that this study, and this was even published again pre-1980, showed that cholesterol plays a very important role in the ability of some drugs to do the good work that they need to do. And obviously I'm not all for drugs for everything, but sometimes they're essential. And if you are using drugs, you want to make sure that they're effective, because then you can give lower doses. So cholesterol really, really important there for anti-tumor activity of certain chemotherapies. And the scariest thing for me when you look at these studies is we've known this for a long time. So why have we been telling people that low fat and low cholesterol are the way to go? So just going back to what you might do and what we've been told from a public health perspective in order to reduce cholesterol, and that for many people means eliminating eggs from your diet. But when you're eliminating eggs, you're not only eliminating your cholesterol, but you're also eliminating an excellent source of a number of very, very important nutrients. They're considered a complete protein, so you're getting a wonderful array of amino acids there. But if you look down the percentage RDAs for all of the vitamins and minerals found in your average medium egg, you realize that things like selenium and folate and even the B vitamins, they're a significant contributor to our daily intake of things that in the Western world, and particularly UK, we're already, many of us, borderline deficient. So by taking out this very important nutritional source, we're further exacerbating a number of health problems. So if we've got it so horribly wrong, excuse me, I'm just trying to find a slide that appears to have gone missing. Something has gone awry in my presentation and I appear to be missing a slide. And now it's frozen up. Sorry about this, people. Okay. So if we've got it all so horribly wrong, why have we got it all so horribly wrong in the first place? Where have these messages come from? Well, if you look back at the evidence, we see that by increasing our energy intake from saturated fat to carbohydrate, we directly reduce our LDL cholesterol, which seems to be a good thing. However, by increasing our carbohydrate intake from our saturated fat, we also see that we get a 7% increase in coronary heart disease. And the slide that appears to have gone missing, and goodness only knows why, because the last time I looked at this presentation it was there, was looking at very early evidence that found that total fat intake had absolutely no impact on our cholesterol and our CVD risk. Saturated fat had some small correlation with cholesterol and CVD risk, but on the whole, when you look at very large cohorts of people, it really doesn't play a huge part, and saturated fat, total fat, cholesterol intake don't really impact on our cardiovascular risk. So we see now, when we look further into it, that if we think that saturated fat is the culprit, yes, we can replace that with carbohydrate. Yes, we will see a reduction in LDL cholesterol, but actually, as we increase our carbohydrate intake in favor of saturated fat, we get an increased coronary heart disease risk. But why? Well, this is largely because when we increase our saturated fat intake, we get an increase in LDL particle size. And the bigger our LDL particles become, the more they start to resemble HDL, which is the good cholesterol, it's the one that we need. In addition to changing the size and the profile of our LDL particles, carbohydrate actually will directly increase triglycerides. It reduces the amount of HDL we have and also reduces LDL particle size, which together can all increase our risk of atherosclerosis. So why is it so important that LDL particles aren't small and horribly unpuffy and nice? Well, largely because when they're small and they're very low density, they are much more likely to penetrate the vessel walls and cause considerable damage. They also, when they get smaller, they obviously have a lower surface area, so they have less binding capacity to the areas where they need to bind to then move into where the cholesterol needs to go to do its work. So these small LDL particles remain in circulation for much longer than their bigger, larger brothers and sisters. Also, being small, they have a very large surface area to volume ratio, and they're much more prone to oxidative damage. So once the cholesterol gets damaged, it's then a problem in the body and it needs to be dealt with. So this slide, bit of a cheeky heading there, but size really does matter when it comes to our LDL particles. And you can just see there I've picked out 3 studies that came up very quickly in a search on PubMed, looking at both prospective and randomized controlled trials in a number of different groups. But we see that small, dense LDL particles are associated with an increased risk of ischemic heart disease in men. We see that in subjects with metabolic syndrome, they have a thicker inner lining of their arteries, as well as lower LDL particle sizes versus controls, and so at higher risk of complications. And the smaller and more dense the particles, the higher the levels of triglycerides and the lower the levels of our HDL cholesterol. So it really is important for people to stop thinking LDL is bad cholesterol, because there are different things going on in there, and actually the size of our LDL is really quite important. So going back to the carbohydrate story, the reason why carbohydrate is so important is because you need to get the carbohydrate source right, and there's high glycemic index, there's medium glycemic index and low glycemic index carbohydrates, and depending on which ones you replace your fatty acid intake with depends on the impact of your risk of cardiovascular disease. So if we focus on carbohydrate as a whole, we see we generally get an increased risk, but that's largely down to the high glycemic index carbohydrates. And these are the ones that release sugar into the blood very, very quickly. They spike, they cause an insulin spike, and then they drop off. So we actually see a 33% increase in the risk of heart attack when we replace our saturated and total fat intake with high glycemic index carbohydrates. If we use medium glycemic index carbohydrates, then very little change, and actually by replacing saturated fats with low glycemic index, we do see on the whole from studies a small reduced risk. But this is largely because a low GI diet is typically very high in vegetables, fruits, legumes and unprocessed whole grains, which come hand in hand with high consumption of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients and fiber, which we know all are very essential and beneficial to cardiovascular health. So if eliminating fat and eliminating cholesterol doesn't work, and replacing saturated fat with a mixture of carbohydrates doesn't work either, what do we need to do? Well, this is where the heroes of the day come in, the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So again, when we go back to the literature, we see that switching from 5% of our saturated fat intake, replacing that with polyunsaturated fatty acids, we get up to about 10% reduced risk in coronary heart disease. This produces a very favourable outcome. Our replacing carbohydrates with polyunsaturated fatty acids as well is very favourable for cardiovascular outcome. And so it seems that in general, just by increasing our polyunsaturated fatty acid intake, we will be seeing cardiovascular health benefits. But as with everything, it's not that straightforward. Of course, there are two types of polyunsaturated fatty acids, or two main types that we consider when we think about them, and that's the omega-6s and the omega-3s. And the sources of those are mainly from plant oils, animal proteins, nuts and grains, and then, of course, fish and small amounts of omega-3s from various other plant sources, such as flax and linseed. So looking at the different profiles of omega-6 to omega-3 and how much of what is ideal, we actually find in studies that increasing our omega-6 intake isn't really a good idea, because most of us are already consuming around the upper limit of omega-6. We're eating a lot of grain-fed meats and plant oils. And so many of our clients, many of people out there in the public health domain will already be kind of maxed out and optimized, shall we say, for their omega-6 intake. When studies actually compare the increasing intake of omega-6s versus omega-3, they find that in groups that only increase their omega-6 versus increasing omega-3 and 6, they get a small increase in coronary heart disease risk with just increasing omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. So it does seem that it's the inclusion of the omega-3s and not just the general increased consumption of polyunsaturated fat that really confer the added benefits for cardiovascular health. And as I'm sure you're very well aware, it's EPA and DHA found mainly in fish that are the key beneficiaries for the benefits seen in cardiovascular health. The main reasons for this being so important and for these two particular fats being so useful in cardiovascular health is that our omega-3s are very, very important for cardiovascular function, and studies are recognizing this more and more, and it's actually now being used as a very useful and very effective indicator of cardiovascular disease risk. So our omega-3 index, which is the amount of EPA and DHA found in our cells, is a very useful indicator of how likely we are to develop a cardiovascular complication. But also the amount of omega-3 in our red blood cells, and specifically our arachidonic acid to EPA ratio, is being used as a more potent and more correct and accurate marker and risk factor for sudden cardiac death, even more so than relying on high blood cholesterol, high blood pressure, and even inflammatory markers such as C-reactive protein. So why is inflammation important? Well, as that first pictorial slide showed, when we get a buildup of fatty deposits in our vascular walls, we get inflammatory cells with that, and inflammation is obviously a key problem in the vascular walls because it makes things lumpy and puffy and unhappy and much more prone to damage. So polyunsaturated fatty acids, and specifically EPA and DHA, are very, very, very important in the control of our inflammatory response. Arachidonic acid is the key modulator of initiating the inflammation, and then the EPA and DHA come in at a later date and they calm everything down and they switch it off. So having optimal levels of both arachidonic acid and EPA and DHA are really vitally important to make sure that our ability to control inflammation is healthy and happy, and that things get switched on and switched off at the right time. So it's for this reason that the arachidonic acid to EPA ratio is not only a very useful biomarker of cardiovascular disease, but also chronic inflammation and just general disease risk, because the more inflamed we are, the more at risk we are of a number of diseases. And by using the arachidonic acid to EPA ratio, we get a direct indicator of how good we are going to be at not only switching on our inflammatory response, but being able to switch it off again. Stress and high glycemic index foods, very key in predicting risk of cardiovascular problems, but they're both also linked to high levels of inflammation with the body. And when we have high levels of inflammation, we have an increased susceptibility of our blood vessel walls to get damaged. And they also, inflammation goes hand in hand with reduced cellular communication. So if your vessels and your heart muscle is losing its ability to communicate from cell to cell, things are going to start to be compromised. So this is just a slide, and if you've attended any of our previous webinars, then you'll probably seen this many times, but it's just showing you that on the whole, we need our AA to EPA ratio to be nice and low, maximum of about 3 arachidonic acid molecules per every EPA, and then we're very low on the inflammatory scale, and we generally have a very excellent health outcome. As things start to go up, we see an increased level of inflammation in the body, and our health outcome becomes increasingly less good. And again, another slide many of you may have seen. This is a number of conditions that are now associated with a high arachidonic acid to EPA ratio. And for those of you that haven't seen this, you'd probably be very shocked to see that everything from depression to cancer to Alzheimer's disease have a very strong inflammatory component, and by directly manipulating the amount of EPA we have in our body in comparison to arachidonic acid, we can significantly address one of the major factors resulting in a number of conditions and fueling a number of conditions that are now so rife within our society. Okay, so we know that EPA and DHA are very, very important for cardiovascular disease prevention, but it's not as simple as just let's fuel the body with EPA and DHA. It does help. It's a very good preventative measure, but there's more to it than that. But as a whole, fish oils specifically and EPA and DHA will be very beneficial. And again, looking at the research, we see that the red blood cell omega-3 levels within anybody within the population are inversely associated with sudden cardiac death. So the higher our omega-3 levels, the lower our risk. We also see that by taking a daily fish oil or consumption of daily fish, we get reduced risk of all-cause mortality as well as secondary coronary events in post-myocardial infarction study groups. So this is quite exciting. Fish oils actually being shown to directly reduce coronary events in people who've already had a myocardial infarction or heart attack. So that's quite profound finding there. Fish oil supplementation can also directly reduce risk of death or hospitalization due to cardiovascular events. So if you're taking fish oils or you're prescribing them to somebody who has had a cardiovascular event or is at high risk of one, if they were to go on to have another event or their first event, they'd be much less likely to die as a result of that, or end up in hospital. It would be much easier to deal with. So it's basically relating to severity. So fish oil can directly reduce the severity of even if a cardiovascular event occurs. On the whole, studies are using a minimum of 1 gram of very, very pure EPA and DHA fish oil supplements daily, and the majority of studies do predominantly dose with high EPA. Some of them will correlate cardiovascular risk with oily fish intake and increasing that within the diet to directly treat, but they're getting fewer and fewer as the understanding of the importance of fish oil comes through. And also, of course, we know that the more fish we eat, the more at risk we are from toxin buildup. And in order to get a gram of EPA and DHA minimum daily, we need an awful lot of fish. So that's 5 mackerel for breakfast, lunch and dinner from now on. So here's just a couple of graphs that I've picked out from some review articles and kind of opinion pieces written by various different cardiovascular physicians. But you can see the graph on the right directly correlates the amount of fish consumption, so this is going back to actually eating fish rather than dosing with fish oil, with coronary heart disease mortality. So the more fish you eat, anywhere up to 5 portions or more a week, the less your relative risk of coronary heart disease is. And that was in a pretty large cohort, which you can't actually see because there's a funny symbol over there, but of over 200,000 participants basically, followed for an average of nearly 12 years. So it's a good length of trial to see what the impact of this fish consumption is going to be. Study on the right there shows control group versus Omacor. Omacor is fish oil that's being used in the UK as a drug to prevent cardiovascular complications. It's an EPA DHA combo, and it's actually relatively low in concentration, so I think it's very similar to just a standard over-the-counter 30% generic fish oil. So even a good quality purified fish oil will reduce risk of all-cause death, cardiovascular death, as well as coronary heart disease death and sudden cardiac death. So it certainly is prudent to be including your fish oils, as I'm sure most of you do, in your personal and your clients' treatment protocols. So the understanding that polyunsaturated fatty acids, and particularly EPA and DHA, is very good in preventing cardiovascular risk have led to a number of studies looking at the specific profiles of these fats and which one's best and how much and what they do, because a number of studies have conflicted as to what the major benefits are. And actually some of them have found that LDL cholesterol goes up. Now, we now know that that's not necessarily a bad thing, but of course, being in Western medical society, our doctors are still panicking when they see that your LDL or total LDL is going up. So studies have started to look at EPA alone versus DHA alone, or the two in combination, to try and figure out what the major benefits are. And recently, 2 very comprehensive reviews were carried out, which were published in 2012, that summarize the benefits of EPA alone, DHA alone, or either one or the 2 in combination. So EPA, when dosed alone, can reduce our triglycerides as well as our risk of coronary events and the development of cardiovascular conditions in the first place. DHA alone also reduces triglycerides, and it increases LDL particle size. So this is where we see the total LDL going up. So when you use EPA with DHA or DHA alone, if you're not looking specifically at particle size, which GPs won't be, then you're going to see a rise in LDL, and this is where people start to panic. But DHA on its own is also considered to be very beneficial for blood pressure and regulating heart rate. Both of them on their own, or a generic fish oil with the 2 in combination, have different impacts on the ability to reduce inflammation. They also contribute to reduced oxidative stress, as well as reducing platelet aggregation, so our blood becomes less sticky, which is very, very beneficial for most of us. They enhance cardiac and arterial function by increasing the flexible and fluid nature of the cells, which means they're less prone to damage, but also increasing communication between the cells. So on the whole, we see improved cardiovascular function and reduced risk of damage and oxidative stress, etc., by having just a good omega-3 intake, regardless of the profile of the omega-3. Despite these seemingly wonderful results of polyunsaturated fatty acids, both reviews did conclude that there just isn't enough evidence for either one or the other, or a specific profile or concentration on any of the cardiovascular markers to show what is the optimal dosing requirements. Just because there were so few studies, the number of participants were very low, the design of the studies was very different from one to the next and often quite poor. So it's very difficult to draw any conclusion as to exactly what and how much should happen. And again, overall, these two groups that carried out the reviews found that their key considerations for future research for anybody looking into polyunsaturated fatty acids and cardiovascular disease would be to determine exactly which and how much of what of the omega-3s, DHA and EPA would be optimal by conducting more studies and looking very much more specifically at specific groups and which profile within specific groups was ideal, because depending on what population, what risk factor they're studying, the response to the different fats seems to vary hugely. So the dosing needs to be very specific for the CVD profile of the study cohort. One thing that they did note, however, from these reviews of all of the EPA and DHA literature is that when we dose with EPA on its own, it has a much greater impact on the omega-3 levels within the cell. So EPA levels are much more responsive to supplementation, whereas when we take a mixed oil or a DHA on its own, regardless of how much you give, the DHA levels remain relatively stable within the cell. So it does seem as though DHA is much less in need of supplementation, as it seems to sit there quite happily. So all of this understanding and the need for more understanding has led to a new wave of omega-3 studies that have been carried out in the last year or so, and I believe the GELIS study was published possibly last year. It may have been more recent than that, but the GELIS study is the Japan EPA lipid intervention study, and they took a very large group of 20,000 hypercholesterolemic patients. These are all patients with very elevated levels of cholesterol. They gave them just under 2 grams of EPA a day in combination with statins, or they were given statins alone, and they found that those that were taking the EPA had a 19% reduced incidence of major cardiovascular disease, which is considered very significant. By increasing the EPA levels, they also directly impacted the AA to EPA ratio, which, as we now know, is very beneficial. And they found that this was very, very useful in preventing coronary artery disease in this cohort of patients. So the ones that were taking EPA with the statins had a much lower incidence of coronary artery disease later down the line. This study was published this year, and it followed a group of hypertriglyceridemic patients, so people with high triglycerides, over a period of 6 months. They were given just under a gram of pure EPA twice daily, and this resulted in a significant increase in LDL particle size, as well as reduced total serum triglycerides, reduced non-HDL cholesterol in total. So although the LDL particle size was going up, the non-HDL cholesterol was going down, so we don't get any of that panic in the air. And this was versus no significant change in control. So this is really nice study, just to show that in this particular group of patients you can have a really good impact on all of these cardiovascular risk markers. The other thing they noted was that at the 6-month point, not only had their LDL particle size gone up, but this also positively correlated with their serum EPA levels and negatively correlated with their AA to EPA ratio. So the amount of arachidonic acid in comparison to EPA actually went down as the LDL went down as a result of the EPA going up. So it seems to be that by dosing with pure EPA at around 2 grams a day, you can really have a good impact on those markers. And then the final point there is just that this huge benefit to the AA to EPA ratio was better than any other cardiovascular marker at predicting the LDL particle size. So it may well be that measuring LDL particle size is not necessary if we're just able to raise our EPA levels in comparison to our arachidonic acid. So it's clear now from this wonderful range of studies that EPA is a really important standalone or co-therapy for cardiovascular disease, because it can reduce all of those factors that we're so worried about without negatively impacting the ones that get us upset, even if they aren't as bad as we think they are. And things are so good on the EPA front that in 2012, the FDA actually approved a high purity ethyl EPA product for the use in the USA for treating groups of people with high triglycerides. So obviously, very potent risk factor of cardiovascular disease, and it's now being treated with a pure ethyl EPA product in the US. And obviously, now being an FDA approved drug, this has gone through a number of clinical trials, and these clinical trials are further bringing out the benefits of pure EPA in managing and treating cardiovascular disease. So the drug is called Vascepa, and the two major trials that have been carried out so far are called the Anchor and the Marine study, and both have looked at the role of EPA on inflammatory markers that are associated with cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. And they've both thus far looked at patient groups with high triglyceride levels, some taking statins, others diabetic groups, so a good range of people included in those studies. So both studies were randomized controlled trials, and the groups were subject to 12 weeks, 3 months of taking either 4 or 2 grams of EPA or a placebo to compare daily. And both studies found that the 4-gram EPA a day groups had lower triglycerides, reduced non-HDL cholesterol, so again, this is a good thing, and other markers of atherosclerosis were reduced as well with taking 4 grams of EPA, and this was all achieved without increasing the total LDL, which is something we've seen with DHA containing supplement regimes. The final point just goes along hand in hand with the fact that EPA alone offers benefits over a combined fish oil, because previously fish oil consumption had actually been linked to increased glycemic sensitivity of cells. So this was a bad thing considered initially for diabetic subjects. So if people had a diagnosis of diabetes, they also had a concurrent diagnosis of high triglycerides or cardiovascular risk, then they weren't usually or historically recommended to take fish oils, because this would increase your cell's sensitivity to glucose and insulin, and therefore mean that the dosing of your insulin and your glycemic control could become problematic. So this study is just really nice in that it shows that in diabetic subjects, there's no negative impact by taking EPA in glycemic control. So it can work for all sorts of groups of people and not just purely hypertriglyceride patients. And the exciting thing is that there's more to come. Obviously, with this now being a drug, obviously with the fantastic results that are coming through, we're starting to see that the Vascepa makers are investing in further trials. They obviously want to maximize on their revenue and the people that they can prescribe it to. But the Reduce It study is now underway, and this is aiming to determine whether high concentration pure EPA can prevent cardiovascular events in patients taking statins. So this isn't just looking at reducing risks such as triglycerides and cholesterol, but it's actually looking at reducing cardiovascular events. So we already know that fish oil is very good in doing that, but they're trying to elucidate exactly how much pure EPA will be really effective and what the major benefits are, and whether or not it is really beneficial in patients who are already taking statins. And thus far, the studies looking at Vascepa and this pure EPA treatment for cardiovascular disease have held it as safe, effective, and a new alternative with potential benefits over existing treatments for cardiovascular disease risk patients. So it's very, very exciting. And it's very exciting for us because obviously we're Ijames and we're a pure ethyl EPA company. And actually, our product, Vascepa Step 1, is exactly the same formulation as Vascepa. So Vascepa is currently only available on prescription in the US, but Vascepa Step 1 isn't. And this brings me to our Ijames cardiovascular support protocol. So many of you are probably in this webinar today because you're interested in finding out more about how you can support your clients and maybe yourself or your friends or family as well in preventing and treating high-risk cardiovascular clients. So as I said, Vascepa EPA 90 Step 1 is a pure ethyl EPA product. 2 very small capsules daily will give you 1 gram of pure ethyl EPA. So it's very easy to reach the doses required by the studies to maximize on that cardiovascular benefit. You'll directly increase your EPA levels, which will not only help to reduce inflammation, but will also provide the optimal EPA levels to restore a healthy AA to EPA ratio and provide the necessary EPA benefits to cardiovascular function, reduction of cholesterol, and all of the things that we've just discussed that fish oil and particularly EPA are very important for. So that's our kind of first port of call. If you know of somebody who's got high cholesterol, they're taking statins, high triglycerides, and many other risk factors of cardiovascular disease, then we would recommend that people start on this product taking around 4 capsules daily to really get those EPA levels optimized and get the beneficial effects for cardiovascular risk markers such as cholesterol and triglycerides. In combination with our ethyl EPA product, which is the exact formulation of Vascepa, many of you may well be aware that for cardiovascular patients and clients who are already taking a statin, that their CoQ10 levels are considerably compromised, even to the fact where they may be starting to develop low CoQ10 related myopathy and muscle conditions and aches and pains and just general very, very low levels of energy and fatigue associated with very low levels of CoQ10. So our vetisorbubiquinol product is designed to go hand in hand with the ethyl EPA, which has proven therapeutic benefits. And the reason why vetisorbubiquinol is so important is because it will give the most bioavailable, the most fast-acting and super effective version in just a 1-a-day capsule of any CoQ10 available on the market. CoQ10 is really, really important, particularly in statin users, because the enzyme involved in the metabolism of cholesterol is the same enzyme that's involved in the metabolism of CoQ10. So by knocking out this enzyme, which is on the next page, you can see just there, statins are HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. So by knocking out that enzyme, you're knocking out your body's ability to create and generate CoQ10 as well as cholesterol. So CoQ10 is the major molecule involved in our mitochondrial ability to create energy. So that's going to have huge impacts, and statin users within a couple of years are basically right down at almost zero ability to create CoQ10, and that can have obviously very profound and significant complications. So by taking ubiquinol, you're taking the bioactive, ready to go and optimally absorbable version of CoQ10, but by taking the Vetisorb version of ubiquinol, you're giving your clients the fastest acting one available, and it also peaks at blood plasma levels at about twice the concentration of other formulations of CoQ10. So this allows for therapeutically active levels to be maintained for a much bigger portion of the day. So many people who are already using and recommending a CoQ10 will recommend 100 milligrams maybe twice or even 3 times a day to make sure that blood plasma levels are optimized and that dosing is really up to scratch in terms of creating that therapeutic benefit. But with Vetisorb, you actually have elevated levels of CoQ10 for more than 8 hours of the day, and the therapeutic activity is about 3 times that. I think the length of therapeutic activity is over 3 times the 6 times the length of elevation and therapeutic activity within the blood. So if you want to know more about the ubiquinol, please go and look at Dr. Nina Bailey's webinar on the therapeutic application and the prescriptive nature of this product. But it really is important in particularly statin users, but because ubiquinol is so important for energy levels and it's a very potent antioxidant, it will naturally protect the heart muscle from oxidative stress and damage and inflammation as well. So it's really quite an exciting and potent and effective 1-a-day dose will really have a profound impact on cardiovascular risk, hand in hand with the EPA. But what about our vegetarian community? Well, obviously many vegetarians and vegans out there won't be wanting to take a fish oil. The ubiquinol unfortunately does have a bovine gelatin capsule, so well, that one isn't suitable for any veggies, vegans out there. But as many of you may well be aware, we have this wonderful product called Echiomega. Now, what Echiomega is, for those of you who don't already know, is it's a plant-based source of EPA via the conversion from SDA. So linseed and hemp seed and flaxseed are the major sources of EPA and DHA that vegetarians and vegans rely on. They rely on that conversion pathway through to the long-chain fats, EPA and DHA. But as we know, this is relatively inefficient in the body, and we actually need a very large amount of those flaxseed, linseed, hemp seed oils to get significant elevation of EPA in the blood. Stearidonic acid, however, which is naturally very rich in the Ijames seed oil, is much closer to EPA in the conversion pathway. It bypasses the need for delta-6 desaturase, which is the rate-limiting step in conversion, and we can see up to 8 times the conversion to EPA from Ijames seed oil than you would by relying on purely ALA-rich flax. So it's a really important addition to an omega-3 rich diet for veggies and vegans, and particularly those with cardiovascular complications. And just to prove I'm not lying to you, here are 3 studies that, again, I picked out from PubMed. Ijames seed oil is actually becoming such an exciting vegetarian option that it's now emerging in the studies as both lab studies, but it's progressed far enough that we're seeing human studies as well. And we can see directly from just the titles of these studies that Ijames seed not only can increase the plasma long-chain fatty acid levels in our neutrophils, which is an immune cell, but it can also directly lower serum triglycerides in high triglyceride patients. So again, in the same cohorts that we're seeing the EPA is very, very effective, we're also seeing that for those people who opt out of taking a preformed EPA, the Ijames oil can actually have a very, very good impact on the EPA levels and triglycerides. So it's very exciting. The second study there, unfortunately, it is a lab study, so can't yet 100% relate that to human beings, but it does show positive signs that the Ijames can directly reduce atherosclerosis in a particular model of high cholesterol mice. And we also see that stearidonic acid, which is the main ingredient in Ijames seed oil that's associated with the risk, the main ingredient in Ijames seed oil that's associated with the enhanced ability to convert to EPA and the reduced risk of cardiovascular problems. By enriching other oils with stearidonic acid, you can also directly increase the omega-3 index, which, as we now know, is an important marker for cardiovascular risk. So there is a way for veggies and vegans, and the studies are showing that this, as a substitute for EPA, can be very effective in having the same mechanisms of support for cardiovascular patients. Finally, the third step, or second step if you're a vegetarian vegan, in our cardiovascular support protocol would be the homocysteine control. Now, I'm sure very many of you are aware that homocysteine is a potent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It's one of the major risk factors, aside from low omega-3 and EPA levels in the blood, that we can directly correlate with cardiovascular risk. It's a natural byproduct of biochemical pathways of amino acid processing in the body. It comes in through the diet in protein-rich foods, and normally an elevated level of homocysteine just basically signals that the production of methionine, very important amino acid, glutathione, a very important natural antioxidant within our body, is just not happening correctly. So elevated homocysteine is sort of signaling this biochemical complication. And again, Dr. Bailey goes into this in a lot more detail in her webinar that focuses specifically on homocysteine and why it's so important, and why it does predict so well cardiovascular health risk. Now, homocysteine can actually lower the levels of nitric oxide gas within our vascular system. And although it sounds a bit horrible, nitric oxide is actually very important in helping our vessels to relax. So if our vessels can't relax and they're really stiff, our blood pressure elevates, and the vessel walls are much more prone to damage as a result of less flexible and less fluid nature for things to relax and contract as is needed. So something bashes into a stiff artery and it's much more likely to cause damage, which will then trigger the inflammatory response and trigger the development of atherosclerosis. Having high levels of high levels of homocysteine circulating around in the blood can also directly damage the cholesterol, which we now know is so very important for a number of physiological functions. as well as affecting arterial walls, and this will cause them to thicken and lead to atherosclerosis. And this largely is because elevated homocysteine can increase oxidative stress on our cells directly. So we want to do whatever we can to try and reduce that risk. Now, this was a comment, editorial style piece at the front of the Annual Review of Medicine published in 1998, talking about homocysteine and cardiovascular disease. So again, it's something that we've known about for a long time. It's not new, but I just wanted to highlight what the clinician in this case said, just to again give you that confidence that by using a homocysteine control product, you can directly help many of your clients. So just to quickly run through, he says that an elevated level of total homocysteine in blood is a strong risk factor for atherosclerotic vascular disease in the coronary, cerebral and peripheral vessels, and for arterial and venous thromboembolism. I'm paraphrasing here, I'm just reading the bits I've got in bold, but you can obviously access this at a later date if you want to read it in more detail, and the reference is there, so please go away and read up on this. He then goes on to say that the basis for these conclusions comes from data of about 80 clinical and epidemiological studies that included more than 10,000 patients. So it's not like they've just taken a group of 10 people that live down the street. There's a lot of people. It's been well thought out and well carried out. And he then goes on to say that elevated homocysteine confers a graded risk with no threshold. So it can keep going and it can get worse. And the higher it gets, the worse it gets. And homocysteine elevation is also independent as a risk factor. So it doesn't come hand in hand with the other risk factors, and it can be used as a risk factor completely on its own. And it particularly seems to be a strong indicator and a strong predictor of cardiovascular mortality, as well as Dr. Bailey describes in her webinar, a number of other chronic diseases. Hyperhomocysteinemia is attributed to commonly occurring genetic and acquired factors, including deficiencies in the B vitamins such as folate and B12. He finally says supplementation with B vitamins, particularly folic acid, of which is an ingredient in our homocysteine control, is an efficient, safe and inexpensive means to reduce elevated homocysteine. And this is why we've developed this product. Vitamin B12, B6 and folic acid are the three most researched and most evidence-based additional nutrients for the reduction of homocysteine control and the reduction of homocysteine levels and in controlling cardiovascular risk. So the combination of the pure EPA, which we now see as a licensed medicine, supporting the metabolism of homocysteine back into those useful products within the body that will naturally protect against cardiovascular risk, and then adding in the ubiquinol for increased antioxidant support, reduced oxidative stress, reduced inflammation, as well as supporting CoQ10 in statin users, combines up in a really, really nice and kind of several-pronged attack, shall we say, for treating and managing cardiovascular disease. So final slide now, just some of the key benefits of the homocysteine control. As with all of our products, we always seek to make the most bioavailability, the most easily absorbable and therapeutically effective forms and doses and treatment regimes. So they're always in small capsules or tablets, easy to swallow. We design everything where necessary for split dosing to optimize absorption. So the EPA capsules are purposefully kept low. in terms of the singular dose to optimize absorption, and the homocysteine control likewise. So the split dosing is designed on purpose so that you take them at different times of the day to really get the most out of the product. So if you are recommending these to people, it will say ideally 3 tablets. We do recommend that people with a known elevated homocysteine or cardiovascular risk do take the 3 tablets, and where possible they split them across the day. The same with our ethyl EPA. Ideally, if they're taking 2 grams a day or more, less is fine. If it's more preventative, try and split the dosing. So some in the morning, some in the evening. If they're taking several capsules, then little and often is always best. So that's that really. I hope I've covered everything. This is us, as I'm sure many of you now know, and that's my contact details, that's the office details. There's lots more information on the internet, on YouTube, on our webinar channel, on the Ijames website. Please, please, please do get in touch, and please go and listen to some of Nina's other webinars looking specifically at the individual products. And what I'll just do now is very quickly try and go back through some of your questions and hope that we can answer a few. Thank you very much to those of you who have asked questions. Oh, I'm very sorry, but it appears that lots of you were having a mismatch in terms of the slides. So I hope it all makes sense. And the one I was looking at was the right one. So if you did get confused at any point, then please go back and just have a look at the recording once we send it out to you. So a couple of questions. So someone's asking about statins. I wouldn't recommend not taking your statins if you've been prescribed them, but do get your doctor to check your need regularly, just so that you can really make sure that if you're taking any EPA supplement or CoQ10 or other supporting supplements, that your need for statins and your dose is correct. But I would definitely never advocate stopping a pharmaceutical without speaking to your doctor and speaking to them about why you would like to do so. Advice when considering interactions between EPA and DHA with CVD medications taken by clients. Right, the only interactions that are even necessary to mention are with blood thinners. Now, the reason we have to mention this is obviously EPA and DHA and fish oil in general is associated with blood thinning, natural blood thinning. So if people are taking warfarin or very high dose aspirin, then you could potentially see a risk. But we're actually seeing more and more, and I have Dr. Bailey to back me up on this, that by taking a pure EPA, there's very little impact on the blood thinning medications, and you actually need to take an awful lot of it for a very long time to have any major negative impact. But of course, please make sure your clients go and speak to their GPs and let them know that they're taking fish oil, let them know that there is a potential impact on the stickiness and the thickness of the blood, so that they can just be monitored as often as is needed, and hopefully ultimately the EPA will catch up so that the warfarin or the aspirin can be reduced in time. Tina, I'm very, very sorry if you're experiencing problems. I hope that the recording worked, so I can only apologise, and just say if you want to look back over the recording, then hopefully you'll be able to catch up and see what's going on. Everything from my end seemed to be okay, so I can only suggest that it was perhaps a link somewhere along the way with a connection. So I hope that you managed to sort everything out and you were able to see. Julie, in terms of the food chain, CoQ10 is rich in organ meats particularly. Now, our CoQ10 intake is actually generally pretty low, around, I think it's something like less than 10 micrograms even per day. Things like heart, liver, kidney, and particularly heart will be very rich because that's where we see the majority of the mitochondria clustering. And a lecturer I attended the other day actually mentioned that about 90% of the weight of our heart is pure mitochondria. So if you're eating heart every week, you're probably not too bad on the CoQ10 side, but for the rest of us who aren't regularly eating organ meats, then our CoQ10s can be quite compromised. And CoQ10 does naturally start to drop off production-wise in the body from around 25 to 30 onwards. So by the time you're hitting sort of 40, 50, 60, your CoQ10 levels are significantly compromised in comparison to people in their 20s. Sort of goes without saying, obviously as we age, things start to slow down slightly, our energy production gets less and we notice it. But tie that up with the fact that many people are now taking statins and you see a huge problem. So of course, yes, get people to increase their protein consumption, increase their organ meats consumption, and that will go a long way to helping to top up CoQ10. Lynn, the best AA to EPA ratio test. That's a very good question. At the moment, there aren't a huge amount of them. The best ones to do are just general fatty acid profiling, but obviously make sure that you've got the AA to EPA breakdown within that fatty acid profile, because a lot of them will just give you omega-3 to omega-6. It might give you some individual fats. It might not, so just make sure you look into it. I think there's a company in Scandinavia perhaps that does one. You can get them through the US. I'm not sure if at the moment there are very many in the UK that offer it, but it is something that we are developing at the moment. So we're hoping that at some point next year, once we can just confirm to ourselves really that blood sampling will remain stable once it's been taken from the blood, then we will be developing a blood spot style EPA to AA test, so that very similar to cholesterol or glucose testing, it should give you results within just a few weeks from just a simple pinprick style test. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for information and updates on that. That seems to be all of the questions, and once again my humble apologies for any mismatches and out of syncing that seem to go on. Please, yeah, I'm very happy to send you the slide, and we will be putting up the talk on YouTube, so hopefully the recording that I've got, which was not out of sync, will be slightly more clear to those of you that missed things. And yeah, if there aren't any questions right now, I guess it's over and out. You've got the contact details there for the office. Please give us a ring, or you can contact me directly. And I look forward to catching up with you all or seeing you again very, very soon. So thank you very much. Oh, Daryl is typing. Lovely to see so many faces we've seen before, or names we've seen before, but also lots of new people as well. So welcome to those of you that have never been before, and thank you very much to everyone that has for coming back. And that seems to be it. Everybody stop typing, so I shall leave you all to it. And yes, of course, you know, Julie, yuck, I remember, awful. Yeah, it's not to everybody's taste, but if you can bring yourself to be eating organ meats on a relatively regular basis, then you'll probably be all set for some good CoQ10 dosing. But otherwise, I'm afraid you might have to rely on a supplement. So yes, finally, and thank you once again all for coming along, and I shall see you all, speak to you all, and email you all very soon if you've got any questions, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Take care, have a lovely evening. All right, bye-bye.